The sun beating down on the marble streets of Rome could feel like a blessing, a golden warmth on a thriving empire. But for those beneath the surface, it felt only like a relentless, burning weight. In the cool, echoing darkness of the domus, where the scent of expensive incense mixed with the metallic tang of sweat, the truth was whispered. The body of a slave was never her own. Livia was not a person. She was an asset. She was bought, sold, and used to uphold the glorious veneer of Roman life. Her hands were tireless, her spirit was guarded, and her legal status was precisely zero. She was merely a shadow serving masters who held the power of life, and worse, the power of perpetual suffering. She was a woman trapped in a system that legalized cruelty and called it law. This is the story of Livia, a woman who had to bury her own heart just to survive the endless cycle of being property. What happens when the law itself is the greatest source of terror, and a life of servitude is a sentence worse than death? Make sure to watch the video all the way till the end. I promise you're going to find it super informative. We put a lot of hard work into bringing you this content, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give the video a like, and share it with your friends. Your support helps the channel grow and motivates us to keep creating even better videos for you. The Domus of Senator Gaius Aurelius was a masterpiece of opulence. Its floors were inlaid with mosaics that told stories of legendary heroes. Its walls were painted with vivid scenes of pastoral paradise, and its gardens bloomed in perfect, manicured symmetry. But for Livia, the house was a carefully constructed prison, beautiful and lethal. She woke before the first hint of dawn, the chill of the stone floor seeping into her thin tunic. There was no clock to watch, only the rhythm of her master's household beginning to stir. Her first duty was the lamps, trimming the wicks, ensuring the oil was fresh, chasing the heavy shadows from the vast, empty rooms before the senator himself awoke. Livia was a young woman, perhaps only 19, but the exhaustion etched around her eyes made her look far older. She had been sold in the market of Ostia 5 years ago, pulled from her family in a conquered province, her name changed, her past erased. Now she was simply proprietatis, property. The sheer lack of protection was a constant, suffocating dread. In Rome, a slave was legally a piece of furniture, a tool, a breeding animal. If a free citizen suffered injury, there was a court, a penalty, a chance for justice. If Livia suffered a beating, an injury, or any violation, there was no court. The master who harmed her was merely damaging his own possession, and the law saw no victim, only a temporary depreciation in value. This knowledge was the weight that pressed down on her chest every second of every day, the complete vulnerability of her existence. Her morning continued with the grueling, silent task of preparing the senator's clothes. The fine wool tunics, the heavy embroidered togas, each piece required meticulous care. Then came the endless cleaning, scrubbing the grime from the expensive impluvium basin, sweeping the fine dust that constantly settled on the polished furniture, and preparing the small, meager breakfast that would sustain her for hours of labor. Livia's compensation for this relentless, back-breaking work was nothing but the barest survival. She received coarse bread, a small cup of weak wine, and a few olives. Her small, shared living space, a cramped corner near the kitchens, was cold in winter and stifling in summer. There was no wage, no holiday, no retirement. There was only the promise of food and shelter, just enough to ensure the tool remained functional for its owner's use. As she hurried down the long marble corridor, she heard the loud, booming laugh of the senator's wife, who was already receiving guests for early morning gossip. Livia flattened herself against the cold stone, becoming as small as possible, trying to be invisible. In a moment of unguarded weakness, she allowed herself to think of her mother, of the fields of her homeland, of a life where her labor felt like pride, not punishment. But the thought was a dangerous luxury. She quickly pushed it away, knowing that survival in Rome meant living only in the shallow, unforgiving present. She was a machine of domestic service, and any sign of a deeper, thinking soul was a dangerous weakness her master could exploit. The worst part of her day was not the labor, but the waiting. Waiting for a command, waiting for a mood to shift, waiting for the senator to pass her in the hallway. Because in this house of beauty and power, the female slave's body was always on silent, terrifying loan to the household. Livia's greatest fear, the one that kept her awake even during the few hours she was permitted to sleep, was not physical pain, but the systematic plan her masters had for her future: procreation. In the Roman world, a slave was valuable, but a female slave who could bear children was an investment of extraordinary worth. Senator Gaius Aurelius maintained a dedicated area on his vast rural estate, not far outside the city walls, specifically for what the Romans coldly termed the breeding program. Livia knew this fate awaited her, perhaps soon. It was a duty mandated not by love or choice, but by the financial imperative of the Roman elite. She had witnessed the results. Nearby, among the older female slaves, was Gaia, a woman whose eyes held the weary emptiness of 1,000 nights. Gaia had borne 3 children for the senator's estate. Each child, a son or a daughter, was instantly designated as virni, born into slavery. The moment they took their first breath, they belonged entirely to the senator. They were a new, self-replenishing supply of labor, created at no cost to the master save the meager sustenance of the mother. Gaia had watched the senator sell her eldest son when the boy was barely 7, simply because a neighboring politician offered a good price. The woman's silent, profound grief was a lesson Livia absorbed deeply. Do not love what you cannot protect. Love, in the invisible cage of slavery, was the most dangerous vulnerability. It gave the master a new leverage, a new tool for control. This system was the ultimate perpetuation of abuse. The law ensured that the suffering of the mother was directly inherited by the child. There was no escape. The lineage of servitude was sealed the moment the baby was conceived. It was a constant cycle of cruelty. The mother's body was exploited to create more labor, and the children born of that exploitation were guaranteed to grow up experiencing the very same terrors and dehumanization. Livia spent her afternoons in the senator's vast weaving room, her fingers flying over the loom. It was tedious work, but it was often solitary, and in solitude her mind was free, a small rebellion against the total ownership of her person. Sometimes, another young slave girl, Mira, would whisper tales of escape, of the dangerous, legendary paths taken by those who risked everything to flee north, out of Roman reach. Livia listened, but the tales felt like myths. How could a woman, marked by her appearance, with no money, no connections, and the full weight of the powerful Roman state hunting her, ever truly disappear? The roads were patrolled, the ports watched, and the penalty for running was horrifying, often agonizing death or a lifetime in the deep, inescapable mines. She knew she had to survive for now, to move through the house like a ghost, to keep her head down and her emotions utterly hidden. The senator's wife, a woman named Cornelia, had an eagle eye for any hint of defiance or even sadness. If Cornelia sensed weakness or worse, thought, the resulting punishment would be meted out not to punish the body, but to break the spirit. Livia's quiet determination was her shield. She lived with the absolute knowledge that the freedom of her own body was gone, but she fiercely protected the last piece of herself that still belonged to her, the core of her mind. The emotional burden of being a potential breeder was immense. Every glance from the senator, every order to move to the main country estate, sent a spike of panic through her. She was a woman whose entire value was reduced to her reproductive organs, her future determined by a cruel, calculated arithmetic of profit. Livia knew that to bear a child for this system was not a blessing of life, but an agonizing contribution to the machine of her own oppression. It was a fate worse than any single swift end. The harsh reality of Livia's existence was defined by the unyielding demand for her labor. It was a daily war fought not with weapons, but with scrubbing brushes, heavy buckets, and the constant, throbbing pain in her lower back. There was no task too menial, too difficult, or too extensive for the female slave. While male slaves were often assigned skilled trades, military service, or field work, the female slaves bore the crushing, unending weight of the familia's domestic needs. Livia was expected to perform all tasks: the rough, physical work and the detailed, delicate work, switching between them seamlessly, without rest. The physical labor was relentless. Every morning, she helped haul heavy amphorae of water from the public fountain back to the domus, a treacherous, slippery walk that strained her shoulders. She spent hours grinding grain with a heavy stone quern, a task so punishing it often left her with blisters that never fully healed. Later in the day, she was weaving fine cloth for Cornelia's newest gown, requiring perfect attention to detail, even as her body ached from the morning's exertions. This extensive domestic labor was the foundation upon which the leisure and luxury of the Roman ruling class was built. The lack of any form of compensation was the cruelest irony. Livia worked harder than any free Roman citizen. She managed complex household affairs and produced valuable goods like textiles, yet she received nothing. Her entire output, her skill, her energy, and her time were absorbed wholly by the senator and his family. Her only reward was the basic subsistence provided, the food that kept her alive just long enough to continue producing value for her owners. One sweltering afternoon, Livia was tasked with preparing a feast for a visiting dignitary. The heat in the kitchen was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and the smell of roasting meats. She accidentally dropped a tray of delicate pastries. The small crash felt enormous in the sudden silence of the kitchen. The head cook, a male slave named Quintus, who held a small, shaky amount of authority, rounded on her, his face dark with fury. "You clumsy idiot! That is costly." Livia braced herself, expecting the sharp sting of a hand or a strap. Instead, Quintus simply pointed to the mess. "Clean it, and if the senator notices the missing dish, you will tell him I did it. Understand? Not a word of your carelessness." Quintus was not being kind. He was being pragmatic. He knew that the punishment Livia would receive would be far harsher, far more arbitrary, and potentially more permanently damaging than anything he would face. The senator often used violence against the female staff not just to enforce obedience, but to assert dominance and terror. Livia understood the unspoken agreement. Her pain was cheaper, her worth more easily discarded. Cleaning the mess, Livia felt the familiar burning humiliation rise in her throat. She wasn't just tired. She was psychologically worn down by the knowledge that her body was always vulnerable, always on the line. The heavy grinding stone, the endless hauling, the burning kitchen. These were merely the backdrop to the greater trauma. The daily, relentless labor served as a constant reminder that she was not her own person, that she existed only to serve the comfort of others, without a single moment of rest, compensation, or dignity. As the sun set and the feast began, Livia stood silently by the dining couch, fanning the senator and keeping the wine cups full. She watched the rich Romans laugh and eat, their hands clean, their clothes immaculate. Their freedom was a visible, tangible thing. Her enslavement, though legal, felt like a slow, deliberate strangulation of her soul, worse than any swift execution. The greatest burden Livia carried was not the heavy buckets of water or the aching muscles, but the weight of her memories. The Roman system was specifically designed to strip away the identity of the enslaved. They changed her name, they forbade her language, and they tried to wipe out any trace of the life she had before she became property. But inside the fortress of her mind, Livia fought a constant, silent battle to keep the ghost of her former self alive. Livia, or rather the girl she had been, Eleonora, had grown up by the sea in a town now utterly subdued by Roman legions. She remembered the color of the fishing nets laid out to dry, the taste of salt on the wind, and the sound of her father's low, rumbling voice telling stories by the hearth. These memories were now fragmented, like broken pieces of pottery, but she held them close. They were her sole possession, the only things the senator could not buy, sell, or take away. The psychological suffering of her enslavement was often more crippling than the physical pain. She lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, a condition that historians would later recognize as profound trauma. Every sudden noise, every unexpected touch, every sharp command sent a jolt of pure terror through her. The complete and arbitrary control over her person meant that she could never truly relax, never let down her guard. The concept of self was systematically eroded. She was forced to adopt a persona. Obedient, silent, efficient. The real Livia, the one who dreamed of freedom and harbored bitterness against her captors, had to be buried deep. She learned to plaster a blank mask onto her face, a look of neutral deference that revealed nothing of the storms raging within. One evening, while preparing the senator's bedchamber, Livia found a small, polished stone on the floor, a child's toy, perhaps dropped by the senator's young daughter. It was smooth and warm in her palm. For a fleeting second, the image of her younger brother, who used to collect similar stones on the beach, flashed through her mind with brutal clarity. She felt the sharp sting of tears, but instantly stifled them. Crying was not permitted. Emotion was risk. If Cornelia, the senator's wife, saw tears, she wouldn't interpret it as grief. She would interpret it as insolence, defiance, or an attempt to manipulate. A weeping slave was a distraction, an imperfect tool, and Cornelia would swiftly administer a correction designed to stamp out the weakness. This constant suppression of natural human feeling was the essence of the psychological torment. Livia was forced to witness happiness, love, and security in the lives of her masters, the very things she was barred from experiencing. She watched Cornelia fuss over her children and felt a deep, wrenching jealousy that had nothing to do with possessions and everything to do with ownership of one's future. She understood why many of the older slaves retreated into silence, becoming almost catatonic. To live fully in the Roman world of slavery, to allow oneself to feel, was too agonizing. The only path to survival was to become a ghost, an echo in the hallway, existing merely as the functional extension of the master's will. Livia's daily life was a testament to the chilling truth that to live a life totally devoid of autonomy, dignity, and hope was an experience often worse than death itself, because the heart and mind died long before the body was allowed to rest. The most insidious weapon against Livia was not the whip or the chain, but the parchment. The Roman law, the very foundation of the glorious republic and the mighty empire, was the mechanism that trapped her. Livia's status as a chattel, movable property, was enshrined in every legal code, placing her entirely outside the bounds of human consideration. She was keenly aware of the legal void she occupied. If two free men had a dispute, they could appeal to the praetor. If a free woman was assaulted, her family could demand justice or compensation. But for Livia, there was no law. The lex Aquilia might protect the senator's property from damage, but in Livia's case, the senator was the one holding the hammer. The law treated slaves as objects, classifying them under the same section as livestock and tools. This meant that the senator had the absolute right, known as dominium, to dispose of her as he wished. He could rent her services out to another household for profit, he could gift her away to settle a debt, or he could punish her with extreme severity without fear of legal reprisal. The concept of crime against a slave was non-existent. Only the damage done to the owner's investment mattered. Livia learned the rules of the house not through instruction, but through watching the swift, brutal consequences of transgression. Once, a younger slave girl was accused, wrongly Livia suspected, of stealing a small piece of jewelry. The senator did not conduct a trial. He merely delivered a brutal, public beating that left the girl unable to work for weeks. No one intervened. No one protested. To question the master's judgment was to invite the same punishment. The spectacle of violence was itself a tool of control, a vivid, constant reminder to every other slave that the master's authority was absolute. This lack of legal identity was the source of her ultimate vulnerability, particularly concerning sexual exploitation. While the narrative must avoid explicit detail, the historical reality was that the female slave's body was considered freely accessible to the male members of the household, a practice legally condoned and economically encouraged through the breeding programs. The law offered her no recourse, no protection, and no recognition of the violation of her personal autonomy. The body, intended for servitude and breeding, was subject to the master's whim, a terrifying reality institutionalized by Rome's sophisticated legal framework. Livia clung to the knowledge that if she could ever somehow gain her freedom, even if only through the formal, complex process of manumission, she would step across a vast chasm. Even a poor, newly freed woman, a liberta, had rights, however limited. She could own property, she could marry without her children automatically becoming slaves, and, most importantly, she could appeal to the law for protection. But that path was narrow and guarded. Manumission was a rare gift, often granted to older, utterly loyal slaves as a reward for decades of service, or sometimes specified in a master's will. For a young, healthy, and valuable slave like Livia, that day felt impossibly distant. Her youth and potential for labor and reproduction made her too valuable to be released. So Livia continued her servitude, keenly aware that the walls surrounding her were not just the physical walls of the domus, but the unyielding, cold, and massive walls of Roman law. The system was perfect in its cruelty. It created property, enforced total submission, and legalized every form of human degradation, ensuring that her suffering was not a personal tragedy, but the fundamental, structural reality of the empire. The psychological burden Livia carried was designed to crush her will, but even in the darkest corners of the Roman domus, small sparks of humanity and defiance managed to survive. These weren't grand rebellions, which were suicide, but small, silent acts that affirmed her personhood. The most vital source of resilience came from her connection with a handful of other slaves. Though the masters often tried to isolate slaves to prevent organized resistance, community was the bedrock of emotional survival. In the dead of night, in the cramped, airless shared quarters, Livia and the few other younger female slaves would sometimes share whispered conversations. They didn't speak of escape, which was too dangerous, but of simple, fundamental things. A memory of a favorite childhood dish, a song from a forgotten homeland, or a shared glance of knowing exasperation over the senator's excessive demands. These moments of connection were revolutionary because they treated each other as human beings, not as property. They were fleeting affirmations of identity, reminding them that the person inside the slave body was still there, observing and judging the cruelty of their masters. When Livia was ill, another slave, Mara, risked being late to her morning duties to bring Livia a spoonful of honey, a tiny, priceless act of sacrifice that transcended the brutal economics of the household. Livia also found a strange, internal fortitude in her work itself. She realized that while the senator owned her body, he did not own her skill. When she wove, she put a precision and artistry into the cloth that exceeded the needs of the commission. She wove a tiny, almost invisible knot, a symbol known only to her, into the hem of Cornelia's newest toga. It was a secret signature, a defiant claim over the output of her own hands. It was a way of saying, "This beautiful thing was made by me, and you, the owner, are blind to the artistry of the very person you despise." This internal resistance was paramount, but the weight of the system was unrelenting. One day, the senator brought home a physician, not for the family, but for Livia. The physician's examination was clinical and cold. Livia understood immediately. They were assessing her readiness for the breeding program. The fear was immediate and paralyzing. She knew she had to prepare for the inevitable, for the ultimate theft of her autonomy. Her survival depended on her ability to detach, to turn the act into another form of labor, endured but not accepted. This psychological strategy, this ultimate act of compartmentalizing the self, was perhaps the most profound evidence of the emotional suffering worse than death. She wasn't preparing to die, but preparing to live beyond the death of her spirit. Yet the fire was not extinguished. As the physician left, Livia looked at the stone floor and saw the mosaic of a mythical hero standing up to a beast. In her memory, she recalled the bravery of her own father, who had stood against the Roman soldiers, even when defeated. Livia knew she could not fight the whole empire, but she could fight for the tiny, sovereign territory of her mind. She would endure the sentence of slavery, but she would never accept the verdict that she was only property. She would live, not for her master's profit, but for the defiant hope that one day, somehow, a shred of her true self might see the dawn of freedom. That silent, constant struggle was her final, powerful resistance.